this evening, for me, is really a way of, first of all, bringing an end to this term in the school. This is the last week of term, as you all know. You all got juries all week and all that sort of thing. It's a busy period for everybody. We're all stressed out, and it's all difficult. But it's also the last week of the exhibition, Eidetic Images, which has run, it's a very quick one, run for 3 weeks in the exhibition gallery and upstairs. This evening is in a way a celebration. It's also an opportunity to discuss the content of the exhibition. What I'd like to start with, though, is explaining how it happened. And a year ago, the exhibitions committee in the school asked for ideas about what could be shown. And as budgets get tighter and tighter and tighter, people find it more and more difficult to actually to show anything at all. It seemed to me that what was happening here was that the exhibitions were becoming, in a way, more and more parochial, more to do with kind of the production of big practices in London, and less to do with issues that were being discussed in the school, being discussed by different units, less to do with issues that touched on what individuals were thinking about all over the world. It seemed to me that it was the right time, particularly as this institution goes through yet another change politically, as it searches for another chairperson, and I felt that it was really, really important to reaffirm the international character of this place. And with no budget and a fax machine, I sent messages to around 25 people from all over the world, London, Tokyo, New York, Amsterdam, Madrid, so on and so forth, asking for a contribution to an exhibition where the theme would be the eidetic image. It seemed to me that there was work which I had seen in the architectural field, which I had seen glimpses of, where people were, in a way, almost hallucinating space out of complex fields of excessive amounts of information, whether it was linear or verbal or whatever it was. Kind of dreaming spaces, drawing them into life out of too much stuff. That sense that things were being kind of dreamt from an abundance of information seemed to me to have affinities with eidetic recall. An eidetic image is, and what I'll do here, and I must say that actually the purpose of all the microphones and the video camera is not so much to record this event for posterity. It's actually specifically to record the event for Heidi Gilpin, who can't be here, wanted to be here, had a virus, and sent me a fax saying, could I send her a videotape so she could see what all the people looked like. And what I would like to do is quote from her alphabet, which was prepared as part of the Frankfurt Ballet's recent production Eidos Telos, and William Forsyth, the choreographer with the Frankfurt Ballet, is sitting in the audience here. He's in London at the moment. And their piece, which opened almost coincidentally with the faxes going out around the world, one of the first responses was from Heidi, and E is for eidetic, an adjective, a mental image, a visual or auditory image exceptionally vivid and allowing detailed recall of something previously perceived, having vividness and detail as if actually visible. An eidetica, and I think that, or somebody who can see eidetically, and I think Alison will talk about this for a few minutes in a while, is a person able to see such images. It's from the Greek eidetikos, eidos, form. An eidetic image is an unusually vivid, subjective visual phenomenon. An eidetic person not only can imagine an absent object, but behaves as if she or he can actually see it, either with closed eyes or while looking at some surface that serves as a convenient background for the image. A particular object may be recalled eidetically, either immediately after its disappearance or removal from sight, or after a lapse of several minutes, days, or even years. And it was that one of the most important things for me about the eidetic image was that sense that it had kind of already disappeared. And it seems to me that as, in the architectural discipline, we are dealing with constructs which have disappeared. We're actually dealing with the relationship between appearance and disappearance, often in that kind of hazy middle ground between the two. And it was in the invitation to the exhibition. The front cover was eidos, the rear was the eidolon, and in the relationship between the two was the eidetic image. It's in the friction between the two. In Diane Lewis's piece, she talks about the rub, the friction. Without the friction, there is no architecture. And it's that undefinable something which isn't a thing at all, which is, I think, an area of work with which a lot of us are beginning to become involved. It was very clear to me, having sent out 25 faxes and getting 21 immediate responses to say that people would be delighted to contribute something, however modest, that there was a sense of engagement with those issues across the globe, and that while not everybody has email, many people had access to fax machines. It was possible to put the whole show together in 4 or 5 weeks from using resources here very inexpensively, and to put it up so that it can be seen as a kind of, in a way, almost as an emblem related to the global situation of this institution. So it's operating, I hope, at a number of levels. First, issue-based in a sense, but also as a kind of signal to the world that as a forum, we have a unique position here. I would like to ask Alison Mark, who contributed a piece, which was a section from her forthcoming paper, which we presented at the ICA next week, 13th of April, called Narcissism and Narcotics, which is related to questions about the status of the body, which I think which we could discuss later. To say, make a short statement about the exhibition.
Well, actually, I'm not going to make a short statement about the exhibition. I'm going to make a statement which will be of fluctuating length according to how I feel about doing it at the time, and more about the history of this with me, because I was particularly pleased when David asked me to contribute, because this subject goes back a long way with me. It doesn't go back a long way academically. I haven't done any academic work on it at all, except to sit down this afternoon and think over the connections that seeing the exhibition has helped me to bring to the forefront of my mind, and which have been around for some time. And really the meta-texts for this subject for me are Freud's The Uncanny and Mourning and Melancholia and Svetlana Todorov's The Fantastic, none of which I'll refer to from now on. But just those are the ones that are sort of hanging eidetically somewhere about in the atmosphere over the whole discussion for me. Those are the areas in which I think the ideas are most interestingly explored. But my own first acquaintance with the subject, and I'm going to be quite anecdotal, was as a young teenager, and when I read a short story about an eidetic. And I was completely riveted by this. I think the main character was a she. I don't know if that's because my identification was so considerable on this occasion, but I remember that what this person had the capacity to do was, who found the world very alienating and strange, was to put the heads of prehistoric monsters on the shoulders of anyone to whom she happened to be talking. And I hope I'm not embroidering on this story. So I have no idea where I read this, who it's by, what the title is, but it made a strong impression. And I hope I'm not sort of embroidering on it when I think that I recall that she would choose the particular kind of dinosaur to go with the particular kind of person that she was actually standing in front of. And so it gives rise to sort of speculation about what kind of person would be a brontosaurus, you know, a sort of herbivore with a very small head, you know, and what kind of person that one knows would have those attributes, and then to think about the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, you know, who would you decorate with the head of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and sort of nature red in tooth and claw, and I have my own candidates for all of that. But, you know, I spent a long time trying to cultivate this capacity. It struck me so much. I was quite an eccentric child, in between sort of ceremonial magic and the Ouija board. I spent a long time trying to cultivate the faculty of eidesis, because it seemed to me that this, God knows why, that this would be a very useful thing to be able to do. And in fact, I seem to remember coming across somewhere else the instruction that if you were sitting in front of somebody whose authority intimidated you, that what you should do is imagine a red nose on the end of theirs. And this is a way to dissolve all forms of insecurity in confrontatory situations. And I wondered the other day when I was watching something from Red Nose Week, you know, just quite what the person who thought that up would think of it. But these are ways of manipulating the environment to make oneself more comfortable. And I know somebody in the theatre who, when they get on the stage, they suffer from stage fright, and they imagine everybody in the audience is just a row of cabbages, you know, that's just row upon row of cabbages from an allotment sort of sitting out there. So they don't have to worry about what these people are thinking or attribute any kind of thinking or feeling to them. And I think one of the things about the capacity of the eidetica is something about divorcing the object, in this case person, from some kind of empathic state. So you don't have to have any feelings about what this other person is like. If you see them as a Tyrannosaurus Rex, you don't have to participate in their feelings about the world. So it's another way really of, as in addiction, which I know some of you were at the paper I gave on that a year ago, of cutting out the rest of the world, of self-enclosing and of cutting off from all forms of interpersonal contact, or having them pass under a different guise, you know, than what appears to be going on. So changing the material circumstance can seem to be quite an attractive idea. It wasn't very successful. And a little later, my own interest was replaced by an interest in the hallucinatory, which was a little more successful, but was actually but very repetitious. And it seems to me that this is the thing with this eidetic capacity too, that the story and the red nose, this is very repetitious. And I wondered, you know, being very interested in the subject of boredom, exactly, you know, what happens when you keep on doing an activity? Why would you do this? You know, why would you keep on repeating this activity? What kind of satisfaction does it give to be able to constantly replicate things? So, there's a kind of inner superiority too. If you can see something that everybody else can't, if you could develop the capacity to replace people's heads with dinosaurs' heads, you would have this secret knowledge and this secret superiority over the rest of the human race, who were lesser mortals, who had no idea about what was going on inside the head. And what struck me is where eidesis would become really interesting is if not only could somebody project that for themselves, but if they could create a situation in which other people could see it as well. Rather like a fakir, a sort of snake charmer, or the Indian rope trick, this kind of idea, which is so create some kind of a mass hypnosis or mass hysteria that would participate in the same vision. So now I try and sort of, get away from the personal experience and frame things slightly differently. I mean, I'm still interested in the same things as I was interested in when I was a child, but I'm interested in them in a different way. And now I call them things like hallucination, fantasy, spelt with a PH or with an F, imagination, dreaming. But they're essentially the same areas. And I think that... Where am I going now? Hang on a minute. Yes. Right. And also the new category of virtual reality, which isn't really quite so new after all. The original space of virtual reality is really the imagination. And I spend most of my time thinking about and writing about literature, which is also a space of virtual reality, the virtual reality space of writing. And so I was trying to think about what was the difference between all these categories of fantasy, hallucination, imagination, and virtual reality, and the eidetic, and how distinct the eidetic is from all of those. And I started by trying to distinguish, if only provisionally, between dream, daydream, and hallucination. And this is a quote from someone called Daniel Ferrer. An element of reality can be enclosed in the dream, or even provide it with a point of departure, whereas the dream can have no place within reality unless it becomes hallucination. And he goes on to say, so we must carefully distinguish between, on the one hand, the dream, situated entirely outside reality, and the daydream, which does not presuppose the loss of consciousness of the outside world, but remains separate from it. And on the other hand, hallucination, which happens right within reality, which is where the eidetic takes place. And he goes on to say again, this does not, of course, mean that the hallucinated consciousness is more unified. On the contrary, it's more divided, and that's something we might like to follow up. But the idea of hallucination happening within reality and eidesis happening within reality, does that, rather than in a dream state, rather than in some kind of state of suspended animation, does that mean that eidesis is hallucination? But perhaps a voluntary hallucination rather than an involuntary, or maybe semi-voluntary hallucination. I mean, it's obviously an ability that some people have. It's obviously an ability which comes upon them in some way, which is semi-voluntary or involuntary, but then they have some kind of control over it. So what then is the status of the after-image, which takes the outline of the real object when the real object is no longer within the field of vision, in relation to seeing things which aren't there for everybody else? Or in the hypnagogic state, halfway between sleep and full awakeness, when the energy of a dream can be so intense, the kind of after-image can be projected onto the darkness of the room. That can happen if you're awoken suddenly in the middle of the night. And what's the relationship of hallucination and hysteria, particularly the form of hysteria known as conversion, which produces paralyses and other somatic symptoms? So these are real things which appear in the world, in reality, which can be measured, and which can be experienced to some degree, second-hand by other people. Virginia Woolf has a good description of the twilight zone in A Sketch of the Past. Let me add a dream. I dreamt that I was looking in a glass when a horrible face, the face of an animal suddenly showed over my shoulder. I cannot be sure if this was a dream or if it happened. Was I looking in the glass one day when something in the background moved and seemed to me alive? I cannot be sure, but I have always remembered the other face in the glass, whether it was a dream or a fact, and that it frightened me. When discussing dream and reality like this, I always think of the Chinese philosopher who said he didn't know whether he was a man who dreamt of being a butterfly or a butterfly that was now dreaming of being a man. And that uncertain status of the mirrored image brings me to Lacan, but not at the moment anyway, to the mirror stage, although the virtual image of wholeness with which the infant identifies is clearly related to the phenomenon that we're discussing, this specular recognition or misrecognition of the self as whole. But to the concept of foreclosure, in which he elaborated from a concept of Freud, who theorized a psychotic defense in which the ego refuses the unbearable idea with all its affect, and behaves as if the idea had never occurred to the ego at all. That's from the neuropsychoses of defense. And Lacan's extension of this has that which is excluded from consciousness and from the unconscious, reappearing in reality, not that he'd use that word, as a hallucination. And his formulation runs, what has been foreclosed from the symbolic reappears in the real. So hallucination happens right within reality. The eidetic happens right within reality. And I'd like to return to the idea of the eidetic as it appears in another literary text. And the eidetic is defined as David said, as an image having unusual vividness and detail as if it is actually visible. And that as if status is something that is descriptively ascribed to it by those who don't have the experience. If you read the experience of somebody who has an eidetic experience, it is for them real. It's not an as-if situation. And the latest example that I've come across is in Will Self's My Idea of Fun, where the protagonist, Ian Wharton, is an eidetica supreme. Eidetic images are pictures in the head. They are internal images that have the full force of conventional vision, but which are realized solely in the mind of the eidetica. For me, it is almost impossible to imagine how it could be otherwise, that when I conceive of, say, a philosopher, I can see that philosopher as surely as if he were lying on this table in front of me. He's on his side, the deep notch between his sagging belly and his hard hip, for all the world like a pass through mountains to a happier valley. Furthermore, if I look closely at this image of a philosopher that I have, I can see all his details, the stitching in his pullover, the druff on his cuff, the very particular gleam of his spectacle frames. I can even rotate my philosopher, spin him with great rapidity through 360 degrees, a bit rough even on a philosopher, in all three dimensions, and yet stay and stop still again if I so choose, without disturbing so much as one hair of his beard. It matters not what I do with my philosopher. In my mind's eye, he will retain his pictorial integrity, his notable variegation, his subtle interplay of parts and whole. I know that it's not like that for you. I know that when you imagine a philosopher, any philosopher, for instance the one you saw asleep in a park yesterday, his scalp scurf merging seamlessly with a mossy wall, your mental image is sharp only when it is hazy, and hazy as soon as you attempt to bring it into sharper focus. Isn't that so? The more you concentrate on your visual memory, the more you attempt to fix it securely, the more it slides away like a quicksilver bead. If this example seems contrived to you, why not try it with something a little less abstract than a philosopher, for example, the visage of one you love most? Come now, there must be someone to whom you can ascribe such status. Why don't you summon them up, enjoy the charming singularity of their countenance? Now what can you see? That their eyes are such and such colour, that they style their hair just so, that their skin has this very fine grain, quite like microscopic hide. I'll grant you all of that, but not all at once. When you've done with little love, what you've done with little love is to describe an outline for them and then fill it in piecemeal as required. As it is to the sympathy, so it is to the photography. That's what's so achingly sad about your love, That's why it bulges in your heart like an incipient aneurysm. For the harder you try to cement it to its object, the more that object eludes you. Let me reiterate, it's not like that for me. So that's his take on what it's like to be an eidetic. It's a kind of capacity for that power that I talked about earlier, about the capacity too for an exquisite form of mental cruelty in the privacy of one's own mind. And if we can choose our perceptual distortions, then I'd rather be with the Borghese of the immortals that I quoted in the piece that's in the exhibition, who spend their time dreaming. To dream is in fact to deny that one is mortal. Without this nocturnal belief in the immortality of at least a part of the self, though not the will variety, would our daytime lives be tolerable?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Alison. What I'd like to do is I'll take the contributions from everybody, and then maybe we'll have an open discussion. I think that will be better. Otherwise, I think the evening will go on. So, Christine, would you like to talk? Yeah, right. Christine Wertheim, that one.
I think what I have to say is probably, well, it's very different from what Alison has to say, and it's possibly very different from what David might have had in mind. I didn't actually know what David's intention of the exhibition was until after I'd seen it. And by saying after I'd seen it, I mean after I'd actually gone round the exhibition at the opening, I took this opportunity to actually read all the texts. A very rare phenomenon, I might add. But there, and so I came away with a particular impression of the exhibition, which was informed by my reading of it, not by what David told me he'd asked people to do. And it was only afterwards that I was able to get David's take on what he thought was going on, what he'd asked for, as it were. And since then I've obviously had time to talk to him, and now I've heard Alison's piece. So what I have to say is, might at first appearance seem to be off the track, but actually I don't think it is. When I was going around the exhibition, what struck me as the theme that seemed to be coming up time and time again was that people were dealing with this kind of liminal zone between what we could regard as form and what we could regard as the formless. They were dealing on this edge of when a thing has a form, when there is a form there, and when there isn't a form. And I would prefer to stick to the word formlessness for the state without a form, rather than use a word that a lot of people like to use for that state, which is chaos. Because to call something chaos is to give it a name, that is to give it some kind of form. If we stick to formlessness, at least we're acknowledging that the name is somehow imposed on it. Now at first that might seem that this philosophical question about the relation between form and formlessness is completely a different subject than this notion of the eidetic image, which seems to be about the question of whether an image that is produced in somebody's mind is brought about by some relation to some external reality, or it's just simply brought about by their internal subjective world and bears no relation to anything outside them, which is kind of what Alison was dealing with, about that relationship between those two things. But actually, these two questions are very closely related, because the word eidetic comes from the Greek word eidos, which its literal translation into contemporary English is either idea or form, but in the Greek root of the word means to see. So that from the original Greek word eidos, there is an etymological connection between to see, to have ideas, and the concept of form. Now this eidetic imagery that seems to be David's premise for setting up seems to focus more on the image branch that has come off from the original word eidos. What I want to focus on is the form branch, but I want to focus on the form branch to see to show you how it leads to a problem with images that is actually, I think, of crucial importance to the modern world, and I think is being exhibited in this exhibition. And if you look at the history of the word eidos, and I'm going to now use the English word idea or form, its history is very generally speaking this. In the ancient Greek world, the word form or idea was taken to mean either a pattern in the mind, a pattern that existed somewhere, and anything that had that pattern, say the pattern of a chair, any real chair was a copy of that original paradigm, of that original pattern. So that there is this world of pure forms, pure ideas, where the idea of a chair, the pure form of a chair exists, and every actual chair is a copy of it. That there was actually another concept of what the word idea meant, or the word form meant, but I won't go into that because it doesn't concern this history, and it's not been very influential in Western philosophy. Excuse me. By the time you get to late medieval philosophy, when the Western world again took up the ideas of the ancient Greeks, this notion of idea being somehow a pattern, a visual pattern that was somewhere, we won't say where, but somewhere in the realm of pure forms, these visual patterns then got taken up, and instead of just saying that they were somewhere, we don't know where, the Neoplatonic late medieval philosophers took the idea up and said, the place where these visual patterns are, these ideas of which all the real material things are the specific instances of, is the mind of God. So that the sense of an idea or a form as a pattern became the idea or form in the pattern in the mind of God. And from there it's not a very big step to see that the concept of an idea or form as a pattern in the mind of God, we can then move to the concept of an idea as a pattern in the mind of anybody. So that's how we get to the 17th century, when we have Descartes, who said that for the first time, that an idea is a pattern in somebody's mind, anybody's mind, not just God's mind. So what he's saying is that thinking is somehow a matter of patterns. It's somehow a matter of visual form. Now then Descartes ran into some philosophical problems and was forced to include in the notion of idea patterns, and I use the word in inverted commas, ideas that were unimaginable. So suddenly we moved from ideas being visual forms, or forms that are visualizable, forms that are imaginable, to this concept of ideas being forms that are unimaginable. And Hume rebuked Descartes for this and said, this is not on. You can't have a form that's unimaginable. It doesn't make sense. Contemporary Western philosophy has junked the idea of ideas being imaginable, being to do with images or visual forms, and has moved to the notion that ideas are to do with language, which is not about images. It's not about spatial configurations. There is, however, a tradition in the West that continues to see thinking as being connected to visual forms. But it seems to me that the problem that Descartes came up against, and which has caused the idea of thinking as being about visual form, visual imagery, or imaginable forms, to be dropped, is because it became very clear to Descartes that there are some things that are real in the world which you cannot have an image of because you can't see them. But with contemporary computer technology and with the increase in mathematical skill, the human race has now discovered that there are all kinds of things that we can give a visual form to, but we can't see, like traffic flows, like the changing of the shape of a population of a species. There are all these things which it's not just a matter of having a better seeing mechanism, it's having a new power to make images. And it seems to me that what this exhibition is dealing with is this problem, that we have traditionally tied the concept of spatial form to what we can see with our eyes, even if those eyes are enhanced by optical technology like microscopes, telescopes, electron scattered ray guns, whatever. And I think that what is interesting is that the concept of image, of imaginable form, of a form that has a spatial structure, that is extended in space in some way, can apply to things that we can't see. You can give a spatial form to a relation, to a marriage, the history of architecture. You can give spatial forms to a lot of things that you can't see with your eye. And what Hume objected to was that in the 17th century, the notion of idea as the spatialization, the spatial formalization of relations, what Hume was objecting to was that he couldn't imagine how you could give a spatial form to something you couldn't see. But you can give spatial forms to things that you couldn't see. And it seems to me that that's what's interesting about this exhibition, that that's precisely what a lot of people are trying to do, to give a spatial form, an image, to things that we can't see. But you can do that. And I think it's important that we drop the association between form, or visual form, imagery, and human sight. They're not the same thing. Although that you might think they need to be, they're not.
Raoul. Take it away.
I will connect to the last two speakers. I must admit, I'm not going to do it in such an eloquent way. Christine, at the end, I get a bit lost with you. I quite enjoyed your projection, but what is this new thing that supposedly produces images of things that are invisible? What is new about that? I mean,
no, there's nothing new.
Right. Okay.
There's
You're pointing out that that is an issue of the exhibition rather than a chronological thing.
Because there has always been in Western history a elision between the notion of form and sight, because the word eidos means both form and sight.
Mm-hmm.
So and all of the words that we have for form tend to be to do with imagery, so that there is this natural tendency to think that a form that we can create is somehow got to be tied to something we can see. There is nothing new about it, but the Western world has had a problem with it because of that association. I mean, I think that's what fascinates a lot of people about so-called chaos theory now, is that visual forms have been given to things that you could never see, like the flight patterns of birds or population changes or traffic flows, whatever. You can't see those things, but you can create a form that you can see, which actually has the shape of them. You can't see the shape.
Right, it's like a map.
Map's a different concept, I think, but a
maps
map is another kind of form of something you can't actually
that's
see.
right.
No,
It's the same thing. In that sense, it's marginally different, but it's the same thing. It's to describe something that you cannot see. You cannot see the shape of a country, but you can describe it as a map. So I just want to see how precise we can get to distinguish this thing that is somehow new because of computer technology.
No, I think it's been around for a long time. I think computer technology has given us, has made it more visible. But there has been a problem for Western philosophy around that issue, and it is true that our culture, as a producer of visual means, has had a tendency to produce visualizations of visual phenomena. Now, that might not be true of architecture. You could probably produce an argument to say that architecture has always been a visual manifestation of relations which are not visual.
I mean, maybe
So architecture is more ahead of everybody else.
It seems almost that we're threatening the conceptual privilege given to sight. Sorry. And it's much more than something to do with imagery. It's threatening the categories of thought that have long been established since Plato, that privilege sight as the crucial metaphor. I mean, as you spoke, I happen to have a thing by Heidegger. But just, I mean, because I was going to use it, but here we go. We late born, and this sort of talks about the privileging of sight. We late born are no longer in a position to appreciate the significance of Plato's daring to use the word eidos for that which in everything and in each particular thing endures as present. For eidos in the common speech means the outward aspect that a visible thing offers to the eye. Plato extracts of this word, however, something utterly extraordinary, that it name what precisely is not and never will be perceivable with physical eyes. But even this is by no means the full extent of what is extraordinary here, for idea names not only the non-sensuous aspect of what is physically visible, aspect idea names and is also that which constitutes the essence in the audible, the tasteable, the tactile, in everything that is in any way accessible. All right? So the very notion, the very word idea is rooted in a visual privileging. Yeah? And if I go on to I mean, the person for me in the present who has analysed that and threatened that the best is Derrida, who, and I read a little piece by Gregory Ulmer analysing Derrida, who sums it up nicely. Let us say then that Derrida's goal is to shift the ratio in the sensorium away from the domination of eidos, of sight, to a new balance in which taste and smell bring sight and hearing under their control, thus requiring a new term to replace idea as the name for thought. Derrida himself suggests that the other of eidos is force, which as movement, duration, quality, energetics in general, lends itself to electronic formations. But he rejects any temptation to reduce the problem to a simple dialectical opposition. The situation rather is that force, well, so it goes on, force is the other of language, without which language would not be what it is. But it's more than just saying there's a new condition here that is generation of form other than sight. It's the beginning of a comprehension that the whole of Western thought is founded on metaphors of sight. And how does one begin to inverse that? And I ain't no authority on philosophy, but I sense absolutely what you're saying. I don't know if that clarifies or helps.
Maybe. I want to talk a little. I don't think I mean your role here to give an overview of the exhibition, have a part in it, but I want to talk about the three things that I did put in the exhibition, and I think they relate to things that both of you have said. That's why, in a way, my comment was more a clarification than a criticism. In this short passage of Homer always fascinated me, because he, in a way, wonders where does one meet the immortals. Well, you talked about, you can, in a way, be not mortal by dreaming, but in Homer's time, you say, of course, the immortals exist, if I may put it in that paradoxical way of saying. So, where do they come into the world, or how do we meet them? And I think he brings us not a visual metaphor, but he brings us an architectural metaphor. He says, well, there's a cave. It's on Ithaca. It's marked. It has one entrance that we know, but there are two entrances. One, the one that we know, through which we come, the mortals, and one for the immortals. And then he does give us visual material. But the visual material is then another kind of mapping, right? You have the weaving, the naiads are weaving the threads, the purple colored threads, the cloth, the purple colored cloth, which is a metaphor of life, you could say. But the space itself is not visualized. Maybe some objects dispersed in them. The space itself is a place where we meet those things that we know as immortals. We know them already. But I think this was in a way the theme of the things that I put in the exhibition, was the condition of the production of eidetic images. You talked very much about them as a condition. But I wonder how do we actually then produce them? But like you said, how do we produce them collectively, or such that we can share them? Because once Homer puts down that plan for the cave, We understand, of course, yes, that's where we meet them. There's that place, as long as we know how to find it. You know, there's this olive tree at the beginning, or we can read the book, or we can simply find any cave. And there, I think the second image is important, the myth of Echo, which is about the nymph that sung so beautifully, that's, to make a story short, that she gets torn apart, and her limbs are spread over the surface of the world, and they kind of nest in hollows, and they sing there still. But what is important is that this relationship between the original song and these new pieces of song, which are things, presences in themselves, which have a meaning in themselves, but they still somehow can be linked to the original presence. So I think what is important here is that we don't have images, but we have presences that appear, and that somehow have to be given places, like this hollow cave, or the hollowness of the of the echoes of the song, or the hollowness of the womb. What's brought in this image of the echography is this machine that reveals. And I think at this point I would like to introduce in the discussion the production of eidetic images also as a kind of a motoric thing, a mechanic thing, a machine that can produce images that indeed brings something in the world that appears to be something like that we know, but we don't know it. It's like an immortal having been realized in front of us. First of all, of course, just the simple condition of the echographic image being flitting. It's very fast, so suddenly you have to hold for a moment. Here we recognize a human being, but of course then you freeze the image. But it actually the movement of the hands keeps going. And then what we do is we ascribe suddenly a whole life onto that image. We say it's a human being. And of course, on one hand, there's an incredible emotional condition connected to it. Can you imagine then what it can become, this human being, what relates to this flitting image? Or on the other hand, of course, there's the legal discussion about what point is a fetus a human being. How do you decide that if there's a problem? So these were three stages of the production of I would say eidetic presences. So that's something that could be both image, or it could be purely eidetic, which I think is in the second case of the echo is the case. So the machine element of these images, rather than simply them being phenomena like hallucination, that's, I think, an important condition. How can you make something, for example, on a collective level? At this point, I'm jumping into kind of urban scale. How can eidetic images emerge in urban situations? But also, how can you make them part of a kind of a planning apparatus, where you know they can never fully exist as objects, and yet you need them? At what point do you need them, and how can you, for example, create a kind of an apparatus that can constantly and consistently keep producing them as an ephemeral configuration? So that's the kind of a leap into urbanism. But I think that's going to let it stay. Thank you.
Alejandro?
Well, I'm going to try to fit the discourse I wanted to state here on the light of what has been already said in large extent, I think. When basically what I wanted to explain was the reasons that lead us into producing what we produce when David invited us to take part in this exhibition, and therefore how do we understand the concept of idea, or rather the production of ideas. When we first started to think what can we do for this exhibition. What is the idea that we're going to put forward? We started, I think, like everybody else, questioning this translation of idea as an essential form, and we started thinking, well, what if it's not actually a form, but playing with the language, it's a perform. It's something that acts, that transforms things, and in a way that was the beginning of the installation or the submission that we made, to think that perhaps what is more interesting for us of ideas is that not so much that they are essences, as in the let's say classical definition of the term, but maybe tools. So an idea is more than the form, is the instrument by which we are able to implement a certain wish, a certain desire. It's a kind of machine that we use to manipulate or to produce a certain reality. And here I refer to what Raoul has said already of the production as perhaps a new possibility of reading the term idea. So then we started thinking, well, what if we understand that an idea is an instrument, is a tool, is a way of manipulating the environment, what are the components that exist in an idea? And then there is a desire, there is a purpose, there is a wish or an intention to manipulate, to change things, and then there is a side, there is specificity both in time and in space. These two sides will help us to construct an idea. So then we started thinking, well, what's the tool that we use normally when we work? We work as architects, and we started thinking what is the tool we use every day more often. Actually, it was the computer. We spend 90% of the time sitting in front of a screen that does things for us, that we use to produce architectural ideas. So what is then, why is the computer so interesting for us? Maybe it's because it's a system, it's a tool that allows us to put on the same level, on the same language, our desires, our orders, our intentions, our purposes, and perhaps certain qualities of the matter, of the site, of the place, and of the space where we are operating, so that they can interact. They actually interact at a level that we don't see. It happens as Christine was saying, not on our side, and that's why we thought that maybe the thing that we were gonna reveal, we were gonna try to reveal in the exhibition was actually this magic plane of consistency that happens hidden from our eyes, and where all these components of an idea interact. And then is when we decided to submit the language, the computer writing of a diagram of functions of a project that we were doing, and next to it, the forms that it produces once it is applied to a specific reality, which was in this case a plane that was folded to distribute this or to implement this diagram to materialize this diagram. So what is perhaps more interesting of the language that we don't know, we actually don't understand how these things happen yet, but we have, in a way, it was the submission was a kind of intent of revealing something that might be relevant, that might be worth to look at, instead of simply working on the screen. And perhaps what is interesting of this language is precisely that it's an abstract language, that it doesn't relate to remembrances, to existing codes, to experiences, but it's a kind of system of relationships where these two different sides of the construction of an idea are able to interact. And that, I think, was the explanation of why we submitted what we submitted. I don't know in what sense does it, I guess it relates to some of the questions that have been mentioned, in the sense that we don't think that what is most important of an idea is any longer the image, or we don't think that necessarily the image is a very effective tool, in the sense that the image relates to codes, to experiences, to things that have happened before. I think what is interesting of this abstract plane, abstract machine, is that it actually operates outside the realm of experience, the realm of an experiential code. And well, I don't know if that's...
I think what I'd like to do at this point is that actually in response to Alejandro, is that I was also very intrigued by, and Raoul, by the machine, the kind of mediation of machines in these relationships. And the example that I used was one which was heavily coded rather than undercoded, which was the way in which in Wayang Wong, in Yogyakarta, the shadow puppet intervenes in the production of the theatre or the dance as a machine which encourages the performers to do things with their bodies which their bodies would find it very difficult to do, because the puppet, it's not actually the puppet that is imitated in the making of the dance, it is the shadow of the puppet on a film, and in a way that seems to me to have some relation to the way in which form and space is in a way divined from the surface of a computer screen, that the shadow of the puppet encourages the dancer to move their body in a way which its joints are almost incapable of performing. And it seemed to me that in that sense of imitating imagery which was almost impossible, of imitating shadows,
Is that what the dancers do? Their shadows projected onto a wall and they imitate the shadows?
Well, not directly, but there is a very there is an explicit relationship, and I included in the exhibition a work by Dr. Mohammed Anis Noor from the University of Malaya, who is in a way a dance anthropologist. What he's working on is documenting dance forms and the instruments which make the dance possible all over Southeast Asia at the moment. It seemed to me that there was a curious kind of relation between the puppet as machine, the shadow as device, and the body of the dancer as a participant in something which involved space, involved movement, involved touch, taste, smell, all sorts of other things, and emphatically not to do with vision exclusively, that somehow bridged the claim, on the one hand, that this abstract computer language, that the images and lines and words and signals that appear on a screen, which are then somehow interpreted, decoded, recoded, and involve themselves in the production of spaces, might also be thought out in another way, which had deep memories, which was not just to do with surface, not just to do with imagining in a projective sense, but also to do with a kind of moving backwards and forwards between memory in the sense of repetition, and memory in the sense of projection and imagination. And that's what was the most compelling part of the exhibition for me, was the realization, having issued in a way a dictionary definition and an instruction to a reasonably large number of people, was to receive what appeared, and I use the term advisedly, what appeared to be contradictory could actually occupy the same kind of space. What's...
Can I say something?
Yes. Dom.
Just, I mean, I find it interesting. I mean, there are two things I wanted to say very quickly. One was, I mean, especially in terms of this notion of the word eidos, or particularly the word idea. I mean, I think it's particularly appropriate to recognize that in a school, particularly a school of architecture, the paradox of, we've been talking about this word eidos meaning both idea and form, and yet continually we're confronted in the school of architecture of everybody saying, well, I have a great idea, I just don't know how to make it, or I'm not sure what it looks like. So actually this idea that we have ideas and then we've got to make them is actually problematic to this whole notion of understanding, and particularly in terms of architecture. But I wanted to go back to both to what Mark Goulthorpe had said and what Alejandro, in terms of this sort of, there's this sense that somehow the visual or the image is being replaced. And I'd like to perhaps open up a small discussion about clarifying whether one is talking about image or whether one is talking about retinal experiences. Because what I'm interested in here is how the notion of what an image is not at all necessarily the same as a retinal experience, and that what one needs in order to understand, and this question of how an image is either a reaffirmation, that in other words cognizance takes place by a moment of reaffirmation. I mean, in other words, if you say, oh, I've got this idea, or I have this great idea, it's as if already present is something, and it's a reaffirmation. So it's a sort of correspondence that's being produced. And to place a different projective trajectory on it, which is to say that actually not that we are now passing into a time that is less, it may well be less retinal, but I think is actually, interestingly, in terms of the formation of cognition and of cognizance, is more image-based than ever before. I mean, if one, you had a quote on Derrida, but from Greg Ulmer, and Greg Ulmer has this wonderful text where he talks about a sort of paradigm tradition that goes from an oral tradition to a literary or textual tradition to being replaced to an image tradition. And in all of these occasions, even when you were talking about the computer and as somehow it's really about codes and so on and so on, in fact, because I know from your work, that actually what happens is some good image comes up and you say, wow, that's it. That's where we want to stop for a moment and see how we develop it from that moment. So it is this sort of, but it's a moment of reaffirmation, not as retrieval, so much as a projective condition, of projecting forward. I mean, that the images operate in terms of production, of producing the possibility, which becomes an idea. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, ideas are produced, not found or reaffirmed. And the power, the provocative power of your work and of many other people's work is the way in which image production, by whatever means it might be, is in its sort of projective nature of producing something which becomes ratified later as an idea, as opposed to this sort of other image, which is, well, I've got this idea, I just got to figure out how to make it. It's not a real problem, I'm already there. So I mean, it's just to try to turn around the role of image. So I mean, it's less about imagining than it is about imaging the world.
I think that I don't know if the right word is image, or as Christine was saying, what did you say? You used some like spatial embodiment of.
We can produce spatial forms.
Exactly.
Things that we cannot see.
Exactly. I think that way of producing. I agree with you that is not a matter of saying I got an idea, now I have to materialize it, because actually what happens all the time to you when you've done a project and people ask you, that happens to us now all the time with this competition, that all the Japanese tell us, but what is your idea, and like systematically, and we don't know exactly what the idea of the object is, and now we are starting to answer to each one in a different way. So to somebody we say that is the wave of Hokusai, and to somebody we say that is the embodiment of a circulation diagram, depending on who is the person who is asking. So it is actually the material organization of the project what carries the idea. The idea is not something that is materialized in the project. But what I am more interested in, and in that sense I somehow don't see what you are saying of necessarily having to use codes that are based either on experiences or on cultural constructs to operate. If we cannot produce these material organizations in a different plane, in a plane where it's only relationships between concepts or codes or entities of whatever nature you want, is more interesting than relating to these codes that have been built over time in a particular culture. I mean, I don't know exactly why are you interested in heavily coded, in kind of playing with heavily coded systems as an instrument, and with what intention? Because I think the intention is more interesting when it's let's say described first as a system, as a diagram, as a set of relationships, rather than as an encoding of objects. And
yeah, I'm suspicious that that in seeing the image on the screen and saying, hey, that's a great image, that'll make a great space, or that'll be something fantastic, whatever it is, that I wonder whether there is a sense that you say, aha, and you may not say it at the time, that the fact that you can say to somebody afterwards, this is the wave of Hokusai, this is the materialization of a circulation diagram, you can actually say that at the same time. There is a point when recognizing the wave of Hokusai is also recognizing the power of a circulation diagram. And I think that there's a moment where you actually have something which is a project and something which is also a recollection, which happens simultaneously, perhaps. And I was interested in the friction between that recollection and projection, which is to say that I think that it is unnecessary to deny that there are also all sorts of other kinds of reflection, shadow, that the apparitions that inform that kind of decision that something is worth pursuing are not just to do with materializing the previously unvisualizable. They might also be to do with a whole series of other influences. And I think for me it's actually just missing out on a possibility to say that, okay, all of that stuff's okay afterwards, but we do it afterwards. It's not part of the game. I think it is actually part of what we all do.
Yeah, but isn't there the reason to counterbalance it is because those previous associations are always in every project will exist because of experience. The one thing you always have is experience, right? Yeah. Which means that to produce a sort of projective or transformative avenue with a work is always going to be, no matter what you do, is always going to have associated with it experiences. So those are always going to be pulled along. The problem with it is the sort of seduction of it to exist as a reaffirmation of always only being given that anything you do, any image you make, any work you perform can only be given valorization in relationship to a sort of correspondence by reaffirmation. That's what's almost always happening. So the reason to counterbalance against that part of it is in order to be able to produce non-reaffirming moments. Otherwise, you never have a projective and transformative condition. You only have a reaffirming, consolidated position. So the only way to produce work which goes beyond is you have to, in a certain way, overbalance it. Because the other is itself overbalanced at the beginning because of the nature of experience.
I don't agree with that. Sorry?
Could I just say, you just brought it nicely. If you want to say something. No, I think it's very important actually in the nature of the Eidos to precisely emphasize that point, and I will sort of kind of talk a bit on that side, because it seems what we are sort of forgetting, and what somehow in my mind Eidos is in a way similar how Alison explained it, is precisely that it also has to do with the lapse. Okay, it has to do with this moment which in a way Don was trying to address, which will have nothing to do with recognition, reinformation, identification of anything, but something which will in a way provide a kind of lapse with that, as like in Virilio's pycnoleptic kind of moment, like in a complete kind of break, and like experience that epileptic has, something like that, the lapse kind of thing. You were describing it from literary examples, but in a way, Virilio puts it in a form of a picnolectic moment, and in a way, Don sort of identifies it as something which we can't actually call experience, this recollection, but when we have to actually have the radical break. I think that's in a way part of the eidos, and it's in a way part of the eidos in its very definition, because in a way, how what you were saying about eidos and how it can in a way exists in Plato, you sort of mentioned that that in a way eidos relates to these forms, but forms, ideas, and the forms in a Platonic sense. But what I want to emphasize is part when you said that they were available visually in a way to sort of fully know them only to the god, that is to say to the demiurgos. So in a way, when we all nowadays speak of Platonic forms, none of us in a way has a right to sort of quite surely say that they are actually Platonic forms, because none of us can actually see the Platonic forms in that sense, because they were always only available solely to one person, and that's the demiurgos. Okay, so we are always in some kind of gap with the demiurgos. We will, because whatever we had seen would have been on a level not on the eidos, because that belongs to demiurgos, but on the level of the eidolon. Okay, and that's when eidolon comes to, because it's the sensory image, the one that we kind of see, relate to each other, and that we don't have problems kind of identifying and relating to. So the crucial definition in a way that will always exist between eidos and eidolon has to do something with this kind of lapse, with this gap, which in a way always exists in eidos and does not exist in eidolon. If that kind of helps the discussion. Oh, perhaps I just want to say that one of the first books on history in architecture that I read, which kind of fascinated me in a similar way and as it worked on Alison, is the kind of history book, and somebody would sort of really be upset how the sources will actually happening there, where Palladio, Alberti, Piranesi, and a contemporary 20th century architect meet, and when they sort of discuss a project. But the project is supposed to be purposeless. But they were supposed to work together. But whenever they are supposed to work together, and it has to do with the Atlantis, and the whole book develops in a form of Platonic dialogue, so there is a clear reference to all that. And they are kind of doing a project for the Atlantis. But whenever they kind of come like very closely together in their mind, what has to happen is some kind of eidetic transformation has to happen. They in a way call for it. And if somebody kind of does not perform in that way, if somebody is kind of too congruous with another person, they just pick up a trowel and hit the person in order to provide precisely the lapse, the eidetic transformation as they call it.
Oh, I just wanted to say that in relation to what Don had said, and also in relation to what Mark had said, that what I was trying to get at was that we can make images, and I use that word in inverted commas, spatial configurations of things that we can't see. And I totally agree with Don, and if what you're saying about Derrida is right, I disagree with Derrida, that we're moving into an era that thinking will not be dominated by images. I believe that thinking is dominated by spatial forms. It seems to me that the problem has been that spatial forms, images, have been tied to the visual sense. And my point was precisely that we can produce images of things that we can't see, that an image is not tied, as Don said, to retinal sensation. And but what I disagree with you about is that you seem to, and I could be completely wrong about what you're saying, but it's what I picked up, that the two choices are either the image is tied to a retinal experience that we've already had, therefore it's a recapitulation or a reaffirmation of an experience we've had, or we move into the realm of, if you like, making up images of things we've never seen, which would then be a forward-shifting thing. I believe there are both of those things, and they're both necessary, but it is certainly my belief that 99.999999999, I won't go on, % of experience we have no access to because we have no means of making it manifest to ourselves, let alone to anybody else. And part of the reason that we don't is because 99.9999% of our experience has forms which we have no way of producing for ourselves because we tie form to the visual sense. And most of our experience, although it has a form, is not a form that we can see. It's a form that we have to access by another, by, if you like, inner sight, not external sight, which is precisely what mathematics is. So what I was suggesting was that what I think is happening in this exhibition is not that people are producing images of things which project them forward into something that they've never seen, but they're producing images of experience which they have had, but which previously they've never been able to make conscious to themselves and to talk about because they haven't had the capacity to give those experiences a communicable form. And my point is that there's a great deal more that we can give communicable form to than we have previously been able to. I mean, I personally believe that we did have it. Tribal, so-called primitive societies had it, that civil society is the loss of the capacity to imagine most of our experience. What interests me about the new image-making capacities of computers, and they're only one tool amongst many, is that we can now give images, give forms to experiences that we have had, but we have not for the last few hundred years been able to talk about because we have not been able to give form to them. So what I believe is the new power of imagery is not to create worlds that we've never seen, but to be able to express the worlds that we have been living for thousands or hundreds of years anyway, and not being able to communicate, which is not the same thing as reaffirmation. It's simply being able to talk about what you've never been able to talk about before. I mean, I say never, and I mean the last few hundred years. Most of the rest of humanity's been getting on with it nicely. But, and I wonder why you make this big difference between reaffirmation as if it's a negative thing and talking about expression.
Because I wasn't in suggesting that I was not suggesting at all that it's tied to the sort of retinal experience. I mean, I think that has always already existed. That, you know, when I use the word image, I'm not at all saying that is based on retinal experience.
No, I
It
know
is
that.
itself constructed out of a whole range of experiences, which may have some. But what's interesting to me is the degree at which, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, and I don't mean this at the end of the day as if this is a sort of primacy, but these are still images next door. And by saying that, I don't mean that they're images only because we can walk into the room and see them, but they're images in terms of a way in which they produce. And you know, I want to emphasize the word production as opposed to you know, they produce a correspondence. They don't. I don't want to use the word reaffirm again, but they don't receive into the correspondence. You know, I mean,
correspondence with what?
Well, a correspondence with some type of experience. I mean, if they become. I mean, see when you say that we now have the means by which to produce images we've never seen.
No, what I said is we have the capacity to produce images of. Another way of saying would be that we now have the capacity to talk about things we couldn't talk about before. We experience them, but we couldn't talk about them. That's what I'm saying. We can now talk about certain experiences because we can communicate them through image making. But what interests me about that capacity is that we can talk about experiences that we have had, whereas you seem to want to focus it on.
Okay. I mean, I guess what
it's not about retinal
Well,
experience.
I guess what I'm pushing it a little bit is to privilege. I am trying to privilege one thing, which is that it's not just that there are these experiences available to us, and because of one kind of cultural, I don't want to say brainwashing, but one sort of cultural degradation we haven't had access to. I want to say that we are also producing experiences that have never ever existed before.
Yeah,
it's not about recovering. I think that what is happening in the production of other types of images is that they are the production, the recognition comes simultaneous with the production. It's not that they have always been somehow interiorized and we've just figured out the mechanisms to make them available to us. It's that they are also brand new.
I simply don't agree with that.
Yeah, I know that. That's why I want to say it.
But I mean, there's something very interesting in your notion that these images have somehow got to become productive, and your notion that images have somehow got to that only happens when there's a lack or an absence of vision or something. It's a pity Heidi's not here, Heidi Gilpin, because she's writing a paper about the traumatic reception of art, where it's precisely your failure to comprehend it that is fascinating. So could it be that there's images which deny their evident representative status, or set up an ambiguity and set off chains of association in different ways? So they become productive precisely by sort of failing as your classic metaphoric this means that representative image. And maybe we're only beginning to get to that point. I agree with you. It's almost as if we've thought in a certain way for a very, very long period of time, and as we begin to recognize that, we actually begin to escape it, or at least perceive why we couldn't think in certain ways for that period of time. And we seem to be one of those crucial moments. And I'm certainly not suggesting that Derrida says there's no images any longer. Of course there's images, but perhaps they're functioning in different ways. And I don't want to be a mouthpiece for him at all. But there's a fascinating piece where he says the word video, which translates literally as I see, should not be thought of as manifesting a visual logic. That the conceptual logic of video and of computer technology is a dissolving, active thing which breaks up the definition of concepts. Is no longer a sort of appropriation at a distance of we'll take something that we know, and this is classic metaphoric logic, take something we know and appropriate it to explain something we don't know. This is the telematic age. We are in almost a chemical process where there's a metonymic chains of association are established, which is profoundly different. So he says, the video, we are in the video age, which is something that you see, but we must think about it in terms of the bodily senses, no longer this idealizing, distancing, visual, metaphoric logic. So it's a metonymic. He used the word force instead of idea. Things are interacting, rubbing again, spilling between disciplines, between fields. And it's the video age, the computer age, which is beginning to break up that distant, idealized definition of things. But
thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring the evening to a close, and I want to thank everybody for contributing. I hope that we can have more evenings like this. There are a few last year, and I think that there's, in a way, incredibly useful, and I would like to thank everybody. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And that's it.
Oh yes,
We did.
Okay.
you didn't let me say my piece. You didn't let me say my piece.
Well, if we don't want to stop, who wants to go on?
They've got a right, David. You forced them in here.
Right. It's just I'm conscious of people drifting off, and so if people want to go. If people want to stay, then we can keep going. I'll have to call a restaurant. But yeah.
I'd like to see what comes out of this discussion. De Kooning's work towards the end of his career in the context of what's been said this evening, given the history of his disease, his illness, and also his later paintings.
I mean, the fact that de Kooning has an absence of memory, he has Alzheimer's disease, doesn't seem to me to be any reason why the images he produces shouldn't be in some way eidetic. From what everyone seems to be suggesting, eidetic images are almost a triggering device of some means which set off very personal, often, I think always personal, chains of association. The fact that the painter that's creating them might produce them, so what? Just that he doesn't have any memory himself. Well, how does that prevent myself having an eidetic experience in front of one of these paintings?
How do you know he's not expressing his experience, though? Maybe he is. If he can't remember, then not only does he not know, but you certainly can't.
But I think that what happens is that he doesn't remember what happened yesterday or what happened a week ago, but somehow he's painting on automatic pilot, let's say. I mean, he's using like what he knew at sort of when he began painting, and he's sort of grabbing that sort of acquired knowledge more than I mean, he probably doesn't remember what he painted yesterday, but it doesn't really matter in that sense.
Well, perhaps his body remembers.
But perhaps even the fact that he, I mean, medically he does not have a memory, supposedly. This man has no memory. The fact that he's producing images which we then look at, there's a sort of latent contradiction in that image, which is here is a painting in front of me that's been produced by someone who has no memory, and it seems that it lays down it sort of laces the painting with a latent challenge, which is precisely this sort of denying a simple representative logic, that the painter put something there. He's absolutely like pulling that out from under the image, and perhaps allowing it to work in a different way. And perhaps that's precisely what's fascinating about his work, is that certainty, or that stability of representative logic is undermined. But I mean, I think it raises a very interesting question about the production of eidetic images, which you referred to. I was reading, when I was invited to this thing, I was reading Jean Genet's Funeral Rites. And Funeral Rites is a book where Jean Genet sets out to mourn his young lover who was killed in the resistance, aged 20. And he confesses that he wants to reconjure a very vivid image of this beautiful young man who has disappeared, who's gone. And the imagery of the first half of the book is extraordinary, as he tries to capture this sort of vivid, hallucinatory ideal. And he points out funeral rites exist, the whole funeral ceremony sort of exists to do this, to reconjure, or for one last instant,